Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience. And first of all, as what you call in French, un régional de l'étape, le régional de l'étape, that is, I'm a teacher here in Nanterre University. I would like to again welcome you and to thank you for having come to the University of Nanterre for this conference. Now, I shall begin with a very, very simple question, which is directly related to the topic of the conference. Can we argue that translation studies are becoming or have become an autonomous discipline? That is the question. Anyone who has taught translation into English for non-Anglophones comes up against the subtleties of what in linguistic grammar is called aspectualisation, the perspective on the process of becoming in time that complements and complicates the simple distinction between past, present and future. If the Congrès mondial de la traductologie takes place here in Nanterre today, then we can argue that the claim to autonomy of a self-determined, fully-fledged discipline is being made here today, is being enacted. Now, as to the institutional and disciplinary implications of such a claim, they can be analysed by drawing on the categories of Pierre Bourdieu: champ, autonomie, autonomisation, present along with the word discipline throughout his work and with exemplary clarity in his Méditation pascalienne, published in 1997. A dependent, subaltern subdiscipline can accede to its independence. Such a law of emergence is a law of life politics, evident therefore in the affairs of what we call academic life, if there is a life in the academy. This then is what Bourdieu writes. Scientific fields, those microcosms that according to a certain relation are social fields, like other social worlds, with their concentrations of power and capital, monopolies, relations of power, egotistical interests, conflicts, etc., are also, when seen according to a different relation, worlds that are exceptions, miraculous to some degree, where the necessity of reason finds itself to varying degrees institutionalized in the relation of the structures and the dispositions. There are no transhistorical universals of communication as Apple or Habermas would postulate. There do, however, exist forms of communication that are socially institutionalized and guaranteed which, like those which do in fact prevail in the scientific field, confer their full effectiveness to procedures of universalization, such as the mutuality of control that the logic of competition imposes more effectively than all the exhortations to impartiality or to ethical neutrality. Bourdieu goes on to say that in its specific dimension, the scientific field differs from all other fields in varying degrees, according to the degree of autonomy, disciplinary autonomy, variable depending on the disciplines, the epochs, the societies in question, in terms of the organized and the ruled form that competition takes on, by the logical and the experimental constraints to which it is subject, and by the ends that it pursues relative to knowledge. So we can draw on Pierre Bourdieu in order to examine what is involved in the claim of translation studies or traductologie to constitute une discipline autonome, an autonomous discipline. Bourdieu does therefore enable us to adopt a general perspective on the question, that is, have translation studies now become an autonomous discipline? Having emerged from a condition of subalternality or dependence, or having emerged from their adolescence, their dependence on other established disciplines, comparative literature, linguistics, to name only two. Bourdieu both accepts and qualifies the metaphorical use of the term field, champ. The academic field is thus like any other field, any other social field or social world. It is the language of political emancipation and sovereignty that provides the underlying trope of academic disciplinary autonomy. A sovereign state maps out its territory, and so a discipline will also have to map out its territory. It establishes borders and passports. Who is entitled, who's qualified, habilité to speak. It regulates its transactions with neighboring states or neighboring disciplines. The idiom can be taken over, the idiom of nation states, of states' sovereignty, can be taken over for the task of describing the self-determining autonomous field of translation studies come of age, come into its own. However, a discipline stakes its claim to academic authority on the articulation between its method and its object. And in the case of translation studies, the object can only be translation. Here, the object of focus of a plural play of inquiries, studies, as in cultural studies, gender studies, or post-colonial studies, to name three recently emerged disciplinary fields named in English by way of their specific area or object, on which a plurality of interdisciplinary perspectives are to be adopted. The postulate being the gender, the post-colonial condition, or the cultural, are social facts requiring more than one disciplinary and disciplined perspective for their comprehension, with the added implication, this is an important proviso, the added implication of a reflexive reinterrogation and reopening of the closed and established categories by way of the force of the object or agent one hopes to apprehend or to pin down. In other words, the force of the category of gender or the post-colonial. And if that is the case, then, by analogy, translation studies can be said to have an object of inquiry, translation, and that it can be said to borrow or call on a range of disciplines, some specifically textual or text-based, others social, economic, political, cultural, but always coupled with the interminable and incalculable force of reflexivity that is proper to the object under examination. Insofar as translation cannot be said to constitute an object of inquiry, insofar as it is the ineluctable modality of all inquiry. If there can be no disciplined inquiry that does not draw on the act of translation, whether understood narrowly as the translation from any one système de la langue in the Saussurean sense to another système de langue, and also understood more widely as the interminable semiotic operation through which agents, human and non-human, convert and code and translate substance or motifs into transmissible, reappropriable form, that we might have to alter the title of the Congress, and instead of une discipline autonome, an autonomous discipline, postulate translation studies, a reflexive, disciplined inquiry into the conditions of possibility of the autonomy effect, or an inquiry into the conditions of possibility of the transcendental illusion of autonomy, a transcendental illusion or transcendental leurre. And the word leurre is difficult, well, translates into lure, but there's more in leurre in French than in lure in English. Bourdieu in Méditation Pascalienne draws on Pascal in order to develop his category of illusio, the enabling or empowering belief structuring the dispositions of the agent, individual or collective, always social. And so the illusion of autonomy is socially empowering, but the practice of translation and the study of translation are there to remind us that a transcendental illusion, however charming, rests on certain conditions. And translation studies are there as a disciplined inquiry into what is deeper than, before, and after the illusion of autonomy. I am therefore arguing that translation studies cannot be an autonomous discipline, because translation, as an engagement with language, or with more than one language, plus d'une langue, to quote Derrida's qualification of what deconstruction is, not the definition of a substance, rather the response, translation, to an ineluctable modality. And so deconstructs more than one language because the plurality of languages and the mutual engagement between languages by way of a bilateral reciprocity of entame, to use the term introduced by Derrida in grammatology, that is the condition of emergence of meaning or meanings that are always embodied in the body of language, always fleshed out. The plurality of languages is there to remind us that autonomy is a transcendental illusion, an operator, an actant, in a philosophical language game, but that when we engage, if we translate, or those who are here translate, when you or we engage in the hands-on nitty-gritty of the conversion of utterance from one language, any one language, into any other, then the illusion of autonomy, the autonomy of an idea, of a concept, is brought back to the foul rag and bone shop of the heart and the foul rag and bone shop of language. And also to the systemized contingency of any specific language at any specific moment of its diachronic mutation. That condition of a ruled, systemized contingency that is consubstantial to any language is what informs and pulses through James Joyce's Ulysses and also through James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. That both works are challenging tasks for the translator in no sense imply that they defeat the translator. Au contraire. So it is that if one is looking for tutelary figures for translation studies, to be understood as the interminable inquiry into the ineluctable modality of living entre deux langues, or entre plusieurs langues, to be engaged by way of a language one presumptuously claims to be one's langue maternelle, then one no more fathoms than one fathoms one's filiation, or one's mother, or one's putative motherland or fatherland. Then among these tutelary figures there will have to be James Joyce, and there can also be Jacques Derrida. Not alone, these two tutelary figures can be placed not in a holy trinity, but the important thing is that there should be more than one. The important condition being that there are more than one, no autonomy once one counts beyond the notional void of zero and beyond the sacred fetish of the one language. Translation supposes more than one language, a welcoming of the plurality of languages, and the impossibility of any immediate intuitive capture of the words proffered by others. More than one language, that involves the narcissistic wounding of our belief and our capacities to comprehend the world, grasp meanings the way an intellectual once thought he could grasp meanings. I say he, because the posture of intellectual comprehension by way of the translation of experience into conceptual formation was a largely male prerogative. And so among the tutelary figures of translation studies, there is a woman doubly subordinate to a man and also to her own sister. Here's the passage from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 10, 38 to 42. Now it came to pass, as they went, that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary hath chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. The man Jesus is speaking the words of wisdom, and Mary is, as you say in French, en train de boire ses paroles. She is drinking his words. Her posture is that of poise, absorption, and thus becomes an emblem of such receptiveness, interiority. Mary is an intellectual. Her disposition is that of what Bourdieu calls scolé, loisir, the leisure of the intellectual who takes a backward stance. The academic disposition which is above or beyond application and toil, beyond busyness, with all the negative connotations of busyness and absorption in the affairs of the world, such as are analysed by Heidegger. Mary is not a busybody. She has learned to sit still. And presumably, this stillness allows for the intuitive communication of meaning from the man of wisdom, Christ, to the listener. Mary is the paradigm of docile reception. Nothing is lost in her. Meanwhile, Martha is busy in the kitchen, and Martha is troubled about many things. In this, she manifests her lack of autonomy, her inaptitude for the pure state of autonomy. Purity of utterance, that of Jesus Christ, purity of reception, that of Mary. Martha is a busy bee, and is thus barred from membership of the Bourdieusian field of scholastic autonomy, the autonomous field of self-determining intellectual autonomy. As such, she is, I believe, the emblematic figure of the task of the translator, who knows that a translation is always revisable, susceptible of emendation, whereas if Christ is the way, the truth and the life, or if he's the Logos made flesh and the consummate partaker in the substance of the God, in whose substance he partakes and from which he perceives, then his essence is beyond and impermeable to any revision. Translation, to use the words of Marc Chentier, translator into French of American fiction and American poetry, John Ashbery and William Gaddis, translation, according to Marc Chentier, is an activity that is vicarious and ancillary. Ancillary, like the work of Martha, busy in the kitchen, a task of interminable rectification and adjustment in the absence of any self-evident rendition, because the kitchen or the domestic economy of space, sites of life living, because translation is a work of adjustment, never ending, and as such, it is the manifestation of the foreclosure, the impossibility, of the non-availability of the transcendental. The manifestation of the non-availability of any evidence or self-evidence of apodictic, disclosed meaning or truth. Ancillary, though not in the way that medieval scholastic philosophy was both promoted and subordinated as the handmaid of theology, as a subordinate idiom in service not domestic but theological. So rather than an autonomous discipline, it is, I believe, possible to define translation studies as an inquiry into the inevitability of deference in language. In this, the non-autonomy of translation studies can be compared to the non-autonomy of the discipline of history. History is not an autonomous discipline. It is the disciplined, rule-governed study of the past, of what happened. History is endlessly being rewritten because the consideration of the sources relative to what happened is revisable by way of the perspectives and interrogations, the framings, which constitute our present, the present of our existence. And therefore, that constitutes the specific conditions of what François Hartog calls our régime d'historicité. By analogy, we can postulate variations in our régime de traductibilité. And that is what means that there is a history of translations that will force us to translate again interminably. And if there are variations in our régime de traductibilité, then the possibility of translation and the requirement that translation be redone interminably refers to or defers to the anteriority of a text over which the translator has no authority, no right, the secondarity of the translator relative to the text to be translated interpolates the translator as an agent subject to a law of heteronomy, not autonomy. C'est le texte à traduire qui est le prétexte de dernier ressort du sens. Even as this law of deference subverts the routine distinction between autonomy and submission. The translator is deferent, he or she is not submissive. Since the translator translates, she or he is not submissive. But since she or he does translate, she or he is writing in accordance with the regime of deference that I consider to be a variation on the Derridian modality of difference. Difference involves deference. Deference undercuts the illusion of priority. It establishes the secondarity of the textual operation of translation. The translator does not translate ex nihilo, nor does she or he ensure the operation that is performed. The consequence being that the secondarity of a translational act figures a mode of deference and of difference that might, a big might, wean us away from a series of transcendental illusions, autonomy, sovereignty, primacy, by way of a learning of a mode of interminable engagement and adjustment. The engagement between texte de source and texte cible is akin to the Levinasian mode of deference au-delà de l'être, by way of the dependence and obligation, the deference, of the self to the alterity of the other. The task of the translator is by way of the deference to the alterity of the text to be translated, and by way of the inventive fashioning of an analogon that is both adjusted to and adjusted and revisable. In that sense, there is an ethics of translation. That is an ethics of textual decency. Textual decency. The word being here used, this Orwellian, very central word in English culture, the word here being used in terms of its classical 17th century meaning, from decet, that which is appropriate, fitting. So decency refers to that which is appropriate, that which is fitting, that which respects the law of conventia in its adjustment, its attempted adjustment to the texte de source. In D.H. Lawrence, chapter 12 of The Rainbow, called Shame, we can read the following passage. They took religion and rid it of its dogmas, its falsehoods. Winifred humanized it all. Gradually it dawned upon Ursula that all the religion she knew was but a particular clothing to a human aspiration. The aspiration was the real thing. The clothing was a matter almost of national taste or need. The Greeks had a naked Apollo, the Christians a white-robed Christ, the Buddhists a royal prince, the Egyptians their Osiris. Religions were local and religion was universal. Christianity was a local branch. There was as yet no assimilation of local religion into universal religion. Now, are we to read the last sentence in terms of a teleological expectation or certainty or promise of one universal religion to come, one code? I read it negatively. I don't read that Lawrencean speculation as being in any sense teleological, or at least that's the way I read. Can we rewrite the paragraph substituting language for religion? There was as yet no assimilation of local languages into universal language. For as long as such an assimilation does not occur, there will be no universal language, and there will be translation studies. Precisely because translation is the response to the foreclosure, that is the impossibility, of universal language, that is also the foreclosure of the impossibility of universal religion or of a sole universal culture. Though the translatability between languages, since translation does go on and is the object of our studies here, is the vindication of the hypothesis of Nicholas Luhmann, quoted here, mentioned here, second time this afternoon, the hypothesis of Luhmann in his systems theory regarding the emergence and survival of systems by way of the properties of variation, differentiation, mutation, their contingency, and the systemic management and internalization of contingency, harnessing of contingency. A logic of contingency that for Luhmann locates systems in a space of neither necessity nor impossibility, in the in-between latitude of contingent possibility, where translators go about a never-ending work of adjustment and revision by way of the practical hands-on, word-to-word engagement that is anti-scholastic. A case of applied languages, heteronymous, where the translator learns and where any mere reader, and I'm just a reader of translations, has it brought home to her, to him, that the self-evidence of fixed meaning is the ultimate narcissistic leurre. I'll skip that. Secondarity is the heteronymous law of translation and is the law of all language and of all living, as possibility, decent, as possibility, decent and adjustment to conditions and limitations, a law of contingency, sight of what is possible, not necessary, not miraculous. So translation is possible, it is not impossible, nor is any translation self-evidently, absolutely irrefutable. Unlike the miraculous identity between the 70 versions by 70 translators of the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. The translations we deal with are not impossible, not necessary, but they are possible and they are revisable. This is a law of secondarity and revision that is stated, that we find stated through Leopold Bloom towards the end of Ulysses. Bloom reflects as he maneuvers himself into his bed, beside his wife, Molly Bloom. Et ce n'est pas par accident que, si vous voulez, si ce matin il était question d'une très belle fidèle, infidèle, il est question ici d'une plantureuse infidèle, Molly Bloom, as Leopold Bloom is maneuvering himself into the bed at 2 o'clock in the morning beside her. So Bloom reflects about what it is to get into a bed and to speculate that one is the first or the last getting into a bed. That each one who enters imagines himself to be the first to enter, whereas he is always the last term of a preceding series, even if the first term of a succeeding one, each imagining himself to be first, last, only and alone. Ça, c'est le leurre de l'unité. Whereas he is neither first nor last, nor only nor alone, in a series originating in and repeated to infinity. In Ithaca, these words are offered as a verbalization of the consciousness of Leopold Bloom, the motivation of what in the text is presented, his possible smile, because this passage comes after the question, if he had smiled on getting into bed past 2 in the morning, why had he smiled? So if he had smiled on getting into bed past 2 in the morning, beside his not purely faithful wife, then this is because of the intimation of non-originality, to use Derrida's word, the awareness of being neither first nor last, nor only nor alone. That's what provokes a smile, for Bloom and for the reader, and presumably for anybody who engages in either the reading of translations or in the much more arduous task of translating and the adjustment between more than one language. For Bloom and for if ever we were to live up to the demands of decency in our care for languages, notre philologie, our care for languages, or in our care for others, with a sense of levination, altérité, then this would involve such an appropriation of secondarity in lieu of the illusion of originality, as a source of a philological attention to languages not our own, and to a world that is not our own, but that is the condition of our possible human habitation and of our obligation to others, part of a series originating and repeated to infinity. Voilà, c'est ainsi que, enfin, en tout cas, moi qui ne suis pas traducteur, je suis lecteur de traduction. Dans la mesure où, par exemple, dans mon éducation, j'ai dû, comme cela a été dit ce matin, par exemple, je suis beaucoup plus formé par la lecture des traductions que par la lecture des quelques textes en langue dite maternelle. Dans la mesure où, si vous voulez, j'ai été formé à l'écoute de l'évangile en latin et ensuite de l'évangile en anglais. Et donc, si vous voulez, l'horizon indépassable de notre existence, c'est avant tout un horizon de la traduction. De textes traduits sont là avant même que nous ayons éventuellement l'illusion de connaître quelques textes de notre langue dite maternelle, qui est une vue. La notion de langue maternelle c'est un rétrécissement du vaste faisceau, spectre des langues. Donc, si vous voulez, translation studies is therefore not autonomous, but it is an interminable opening onto the plurality of languages.